The 2000s were a transformational time in gaming with huge technological improvements allowing for massive new titles that we had never dreamed of before. But not every release in this decade was a success. Some releases underperformed, lost money, or even flopped completely. Some were victims of circumstance, while others tried something new and bold that didn't stick. Still more did well enough in one region but just couldn't break out globally. And of course there were some where, well, let's just say they got what they deserved. We're gonna start with this category. John Romero's about to make you his bitch. This was the promise of a major marketing campaign for the game Daikatana, released in 2000. Romero had built a huge reputation for himself in the FPS world with titles like Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, and Quake. The man practically single-handedly created the genre, so while the unorthodox ad definitely turned off a lot of people, it also did its job in generating a fair bit of hype for the game. But when it released, Daikatana definitely did not live up to the hype. Critics cited outdated graphics, repetitive sound effects, and poor AI as major drawbacks. The AI of the computer-controlled sidekicks was especially frustrating for players. This was obviously not the response publisher Eidos was looking for, considering the massive $25 million they'd invested in the game. Daikatana needed to sell 2.5 million copies just to break even, and of course it fell way short of that. By 4 months after launch, the game had only sold 40,000 copies, and it was obvious that the 25 million had gone down the drain along with the better part of John Romero's reputation. And as for that ad, 10 years later in 2010, a remorseful Romero said in an interview, "Up until that ad, I felt I had a great relationship with the gamer and the game development community, and that ad changed everything. I regret it and I apologize for it. For what it's worth, we forgive you, John." Rarely has any star risen and fallen faster than it did with developer Sigil Games. Founded by several former Sony employees that had worked together on EverQuest, the new studio got to work on their first ever game, Vanguard's Saga of Heroes. A high fantasy MMORPG, Vanguard launched with bugs, performance problems, and incomplete content after having had a release pushed forward by a whopping 6 months because of financial pressures. Players were disappointed, with some calling it pre-alpha level quality. The fact that the game was up against the release of the Burning Crusade expansion for World of Warcraft, along with other established MMOs like Lord of the Rings Online and Guild Wars, makes it no surprise that even though a surprising 240,000 people bought the game, fewer than half that number decided to subscribe beyond the free month that came with the game. This shrank even further over the next few months to less than 40,000 active players. Things got so bad that Sigil ended up going bankrupt and being sold off to none other than Sony, the very company the founding members had split off from only a few years earlier. As for Vanguard, it racked up a few wins at MMORPG's 2007 MMOWTF Awards like Least Fun and Lamest Launch. Amazingly though, Sony was able to turn it around somewhat, fixing many of the bugs and adding much needed content to at least get the game into a playable state, where it was able to limp along until shutting down in 2013. Haze is an FPS set in a dystopian future about a 3-day conflict between a mega corporation and a group of rebels, with soldiers using a performance-enhancing drug called Nectar to reduce recoil and increase vision, among other things. Originally planned as a multi-platform release, only the PS3 version ended up making it to market as the Xbox 360 and PC versions were cancelled. Why, you might ask? Perhaps Jeff Haynes at IGN put it best, criticizing what he called the horrible plot, weak gameplay mechanics, and visuals that are truly underwhelming. Since then, the game's been listed by publications like The Guardian as one of the worst games of all time. The technical problems were so severe that players just couldn't get past them and sales suffered. And the flop was a significant financial blow as Ubisoft and developer Free Radical put a lot of money into marketing Haze, even getting new metal band Korn to record an original song for the game. Losses were so bad that developer Free Radical ended up going bankrupt the following year, the failure that was Haze compounded by the cancellation of other major games, Star Wars Battlefront 3 by the publisher right as it was nearing completion. A survival horror game published by Atari, 2008's Alone in the Dark is actually the 6th in a series that started way back in 1992 with a beloved PC game of the same name that was billed by Guinness World Records as the first ever 3D survival horror game. So there's definitely some pedigree behind this title. Unfortunately, the game did not live up to its lofty ancestor. Alone in the Dark was ripped by critics for its convoluted narrative and frustrating gameplay mechanics like a cumbersome inventory management system and overly precise joystick controls. Making matters worse, Atari started threatening several gaming sites with lawsuits for publishing negative reviews of the game. Shockingly, they even accused some reviewers of illegally pirating the game. Dutch site Gamer.nl went public claiming that they were told by Atari that only high-scoring reviews were allowed to break the post-release embargo date imposed by the publisher. All of this brought a lot of negative attention to the game and only focused gamers' attentions on the serious technical flaws. And as a result, the game failed to sell the 2 or 3 million copies that David Gardner's head of developer Infogrames estimated were needed to turn a profit. Legendary is an FPS that features Charles Deckard, a thief who accidentally opens Pandora's box, unleashing mythological creatures into modern settings like New York City and London. It is an interesting setup, but is betrayed by the game's bland gameplay mechanics, weak story development, technical design flaws, and overall derivative nature. Eurogamer called the Xbox 360 version hilariously bad and said that it took the cutting-edge Unreal Engine 3 and somehow made it look like a mod for Half-Life. Apparently a sequel to Legendary was planned but cancelled due to this one's flop. Instead, developer Spark Unlimited started working on a game based on the Highlander film. This too was cancelled though after the successful pitch of a sequel to Capcom's Lost Planet 2. When this game, Lost Planet 3, flopped as well, Spark got one more kick at the can with Ninja Gaiden Z in 2014, another failure that finally sank the studio. Turning Point: Fall of Liberty is yet another Spark Unlimited FPS with a pretty killer concept. It's set in an alternate history where Winston Churchill dies in 1931, leading to Nazi Germany invading the United States by 1953. You start the game as Dan Carson, an average Joe construction worker turned resistance fighter, with the goal of not necessarily winning the war and freeing the nation, but instead just surviving in a world that's collapsing into chaos. But the storyline fails to capitalize on the cool premise. The gameplay was derided as outdated, with missions featuring overly repetitive objectives. The multiplayer mode, which is essentially just deathmatch across 4 fairly simplistic maps, couldn't save it either. At this point, it might surprise you to learn that Spark Unlimited actually did have one successful game, which happened to be their first game ever, Call of Duty Finest Hour in 2004. This might explain why they got so many second chances over the next decade. Damnation was the first and only game developed by Blue Omega Entertainment, a small film studio that had just 2 horror film flops under their belt. A third-person shooter set in an alternate history version of the USA where the Civil War doesn't end in 1865 but rather continues as technology advances. Damnation was universally hated by critics, with Greg Miller at IGN harshly warning that gamers should avoid this game at all costs. Originally beginning life as a fairly well-received and popular Unreal Tournament 2004 mod, and even winning second place for the best total conversion mod in Epic Games' high-profile Make Something Unreal contest, it became painfully clear that standards are a lot different when you go to market as a full standalone title. Numerous delays in development didn't help either, despite a spokesperson for publisher Codemaster telling Eurogamer magazine that this would result in a much stronger and better game. Published by Bethesda, who had already begun to build a strong reputation for themselves with the Elder Scrolls and Fallout series, hopes were high when Rogue Warrior came out in 2009. Instead, what we got was one of the games widely considered to be among the worst games ever made. Development had begun back in 2006, with Bethesda partnering with developer Zombie Studios, a reasonably respected outfit that had gained some notoriety for their Spec Ops series. 3 years later, after almost total silence from the game, Bethesda marketing VP Pete Hines explained that they'd switched developers completely to British outfit Rebellion Developments, saying, "Suffice it to say, we were not happy with what the direction of that project was. We felt it needed a change in scope and a change in focus. And we felt that that was the focus that it needed, that the sort of squad-based tactical, in a sense I guess it was turning into a bit of a Navy SEAL game, and it was less of a Richard Marcinko game." Richard Marcinko, by the way, was a badass, if a bit controversial, Navy SEAL commander that rose to prominence in 1992 when he released the autobiographical book Rogue Warrior, in which he discussed his career as a SEAL and also as the commander of the Navy's counter-terrorist unit Red Cell. According to Marcinko in the book, Red Cell was directed to test the Navy's anti-terrorist capabilities by infiltrating supposedly impenetrable assets like bases and nuclear submarines, which they successfully pulled off. Pretty good material to make a game based on, and they even got actor Mickey Rourke to play Marcinko. But people just couldn't get past the bland, boring gameplay, poor enemy AI, outdated graphics, and subpar writing with over-the-top use of profanity, so the game ended up flopping. Mortal Kombat Special Forces departs from the usual Mortal Kombat formula of fighting games or even 2D side-scrolling action like 1997's Mythology's Sub-Zero, instead featuring Jax Briggs in a third-person adventure game prequel to the original Mortal Kombat. Special Forces released to near unprecedented negative critical reception. Poor level design was a common complaint, with navigation and environmental interaction feeling clunky. And garbage camera angles made it tough to sometimes even see your enemies, a problem that should have been solved in a high-budget 3D game by the new millennium. So what went so wrong? Well, everyone involved seems to agree that the main problem was the mass departure of a good portion of the veteran Mortal Kombat dev team, including none other than co-creator John Tobias himself, who left to create his own studio. Ed Boon, the other co-creator who ended up staying and still works at Midway on Mortal Kombat to this day, has stated, "The game had a pretty bumpy development ride and the game didn't turn out very good at all." For his part, Tobias has understandably distanced himself from the game, saying, "You know, I really never played it. I saw it at E3 and I maybe played it for like 5 minutes and I never really played it after that, so I'm really not familiar with how it ended up." The passive aggressiveness there is kind of palpable, isn't it? Leisure Suit Larry is an adult adventure game series that centers on unsuccessful middle-aged pickup artist Larry Laffer. Despite its niche appeal and stark departure from developer and publisher Sierra's usual family-friendly image, the series enjoyed a pretty consistent and reliable amount of commercial success in the 90s. Even 2004's entry Magna Cum Laude did alright, keeping things fresh by introducing a new protagonist, Larry's nephew. Sometimes criticized for its obvious sexual humor and over-reliance on nudity, the Leisure Suit Larry series found a home mainly with boomers who wanted to laugh and appreciated the novelty of adult-themed video games, nudity included, especially ones that were accessible point-and-click adventure titles, which made it all the more baffling when developer Team 17 made the decision to switch to 3D action adventure and remove all nudity and sexual content, with executive producer John Melchior saying, "I have always been a believer that nudity is a mask for poor gameplay. There is no nudity in this version of Larry. In the old days it was taboo to see nudity in games, but now people are just a Google search away on the internet. It has lost its cool factor it once had." It's a fair point, but then this begs the question, why even make another Leisure Suit Larry game at all? If the answer includes good story, interesting gameplay, polished artwork and visuals, and exciting missions, we're afraid to say this game still misses the mark on all counts. Wrestling games were popular in the early 2000s. The Simpsons was popular in the early 2000s. You thinking what I'm thinking? Apparently Fox Interactive was, contracting Big Ape Productions to create the first and only Simpsons wrestling game for release in 2001. Director of Worldwide Brand Marketing for Fox Interactive, Carly Young, who was obviously very in touch with the prevailing gaming culture at the time, spoke about the game at E3 a year before release, saying, "With such an overwhelming response to our previous Simpsons titles, we want to give fans another dose of Bart and Homer, this time for PlayStation gamers." Coming out very late in PS1's life cycle, in fact a full year after release of the PS2, The Simpsons Wrestling quickly became known as one of the worst games ever. The graphics are shoddy and gameplay depth and controls are laughably simplistic compared to other wrestling games that were available at the same time, like WWF No Mercy on the N64 and SmackDown 2 on the PlayStation. Those games significantly outsold The Simpsons Wrestling, as did the majority of earlier Simpsons titles referenced by Ms. Young. Luckily, the reputation of the franchise would recover somewhat later in the year with the next-gen title Road Rage. The first ever Mortal Kombat game to come to a handheld console was 2001's Mortal Kombat Advance, and as it turns out, there were still some kinks to work out. The ill-fated port of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 was called the worst game of the year by GameSpot, who summarized the gameplay as astoundingly awful. The Game Boy Advance's 4-button layout, compared to the 6-button arcade original, leads to unintuitive controls, making special moves and combos difficult to execute. The visuals, both the character models and backgrounds, were criticized for being low quality. And yes, this was a handheld, so expectations need to be adjusted, but even compared to contemporaries on the GBA, the game looks bad. The AI is also frustrating, making single player especially annoying. Players at the time agreed, and very few people bought the game. Undeterred, Midway surprisingly tried again the following year with another GBA game, Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. This one was a huge success, both critically and commercially, selling millions of copies. Universal Studios Theme Park Adventure is set in a virtual Universal Studios theme park, where players complete minigames loosely based on real-life attractions such as Back to the Future, Jaws, and E.T. Adventure. Hosted by Woody Woodpecker, the game aimed to offer a virtual theme park experience, an exciting prospect perhaps, especially for those who couldn't afford to make the trip out to California or Florida. Unfortunately, the game did not deliver on this promise. The GameCube graphics were not immersive and are considered bad even by previous gen N64 standards. And despite this, poor optimization make the game choppy, with stuttering and frame rate issues occurring frequently. Gameplay is confusing and convoluted, and some of the mini-games are especially disappointing, like the Waterworld one, which is really a glorified cinematic with basically no interactive component. Another weird inclusion is the mechanic where you go around collecting trash from around the park, earning points to unlock more attractions. Not only is this boring and unengaging, it probably doesn't give people a flattering impression of the parks themselves. Spyro: Enter the Dragonfly, released in 2002 for PS2 and GameCube, flopped commercially due to its poor quality, falling way short of high expectations fostered by the series up until then. Unlike its predecessors developed by Insomniac Games, publisher Universal opted to go with two brand new studios, Equinox Digital Entertainment and Check 6 Studios, for Enter the Dragonfly. This would prove a disastrous decision as development was marked by a rushed timeline, creative disagreements, and even a complete restart just a month into production. The result was a game riddled with issues. First, there are the technical flaws, with players encountering frequent bugs and glitches, load times stretching over 40 seconds, and frame rates dipping below 20 FPS often, rendering gameplay choppy and frustrating. If you can get past that, the design itself also disappoints, with uninspired, overly spacious levels that feel empty. Collectibles, like dragonflies players had to chase down, are tedious and lack creativity, draining enjoyment. Ted Price, the original developer Insomniac's president, smugly labeled it an absolute travesty, reflecting its failure to uphold the series' legacy. Universal/Vivendi would cycle through a long list of developers for further Spyro games throughout the rest of the decade until the publisher merged with Activision, who put the series on hiatus for the next 10 years. When critics are comparing your game to Superman 64, you know you're in trouble. This was the fate of Batman Dark Tomorrow when it released in 2003. Critics and players alike panned the game for its unplayable gameplay, plagued by stiff, unresponsive controls and a frustrating camera system. The combat's incredibly tedious, with the idea being that enemies recover quickly unless Batman performs a repetitive handcuffing animation, which totally disrupts any sense of flow. Similarly, the stealth mechanics force players to crawl at a snail's pace to avoid detection, making missions feel slow and aggravating. Former staff member Dave Vout revealed that lead producer Yuki Takafumi prioritized cinematics over gameplay, leaving core mechanics unpolished. Because of this, and combined with an initial scope that was just way more than should have ever been greenlit, the game took a whole 4 years to develop. The storyline, though ambitious, is confusing and lacks direction, with a special good ending that's nearly impossible to unlock without prior knowledge of it. However, some players did find the story all around to be a slight silver lining to the dark cloud that was Dark Tomorrow. Drake of the 99 Dragons is a third-person shooter where players control Drake, an undead assassin seeking revenge against a crime lord in a supernatural comic book-styled world. The game flopped so epically due to its abysmal quality that plans for launching a multimedia franchise complete with comics and an animated series were immediately scrapped. Developed by Idle FX and published by Majesco Entertainment, the game is plagued by crucial flaws that alienated both players and critics alike. The controls are notoriously buggy, with an unreliable auto-aim feature that locks onto enemies in completely different rooms, and a frustrating design where camera movement and aiming shares the same thumbstick, making combat nearly unplayable. The storyline is convoluted and poorly executed, compounded by subpar graphics despite an interesting cel-shaded comic book aesthetic. Voice acting is also lackluster. Critics were merciless. Adam Sessler of XPlay declared, "There's no reason to buy this game, no reason to rent this game, no reason to say any more about this game." Brutal. The glaring issues cemented Drake and the 99 Dragons' reputation as one of the worst games of its era. Big Rigs: Over-the-Road Racing was released in 2003 by at that time relatively unknown publisher Game Mill Publishing, along with developer Stellar Stone, which was a US studio that mainly outsourced development to Eastern European countries. Big Rigs was meant to be an exciting racing game where players drove semi-trailer trucks through US routes, racing opponents while dodging law enforcement. Instead, it released in a blatantly unfinished state, falling far short of consumer expectations for what even constitutes a game. It lacks basic mechanics. For example, there's no collision detection, letting players drive straight through objects and trucks, stripping away any racing challenge. And speaking of challenge, opponent trucks don't even move, making competition non-existent. One of the 5 tracks even just crashes the game entirely. Graphics are outdated with crude models and textures, and no sound effects dulls the experience further. Critics trashed it. Alex Navarro at GameSpot called it as bad as your mind will allow you to comprehend, pointing to its high number of bugs and lack of proper gameplay. The infamous "Your winner" screen with its grammatical error became a mocking emblem of the game's failure. To this day, Big Rigs is the worst rated game on Metacritic. It received a Steam re-release in April 2025 because of course, and somehow achieved mostly positive reviews. Though there's been some suspicion due to the game apparently continuing to run in the background after being closed. Secret spyware crypto miner, or just the same buggy poor quality one might expect with a game like this. Perhaps we'll never know for sure. Charlie's Angels began life back in 1976 with a TV series about 3 crime-fighting women working for a private detective agency in LA. The brand achieved its highest level of success in the early 2000s with the release of the movie Charlie's Angels and its sequel Full Throttle in 2000 and 2003 respectively. The game begins on a beach beauty pageant runway. Donning swimsuits, Natalie and Alex must battle their way from the beach through the community and warehouse to reach the docks. As a beat-em-up title, it disappointed players with its simplistic and repetitive gameplay, relying on basic punches and kicks against mindless enemies with no depth or strategic variety. The game's linear levels offer little exploration, while its weak story fails to capture the charm of the movies. Technical issues further plague the experience with bugs and glitches like enemies stuck in walls or unexpected freezes. And visually, the game is subpar, especially as a 6th-gen title. In short, the game is just about as bad as should have probably been expected of a movie tie-in cash grab based on a movie like Charlie's Angels, and what would have really surprised is if the game ended up being actually good. A platformer where you take on the role of the titular ninja bread man across 3 levels, this game kicked off the decline and eventual end of the road for developer Data Design Interactive, which had been surprisingly prolific until that point, with titles like Nickelodeon Party Blast, Lego Rock Riders, and Kids Sports. Ninja Bread Man received shockingly low critical review scores for its frustrating camera controls, crude graphics, practically non-existent story, and its overall lack of content in short, roughly 30-minute length. The game totally flopped on the PS2 and PC when it launched in 2005, and just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, the studio made the surprising decision to re-release it for the Wii. This version, which included rudimentary Wii remote motion controls and IR functionality, managed to do even worse. The buggy, broken mess got scores near or even at the minimum of the rating scale from major outlets and contributed to complaints that were starting to surface about shovelware on the Wii system. Bomberman Act Zero took the light, colorful Bomberman that fans of the long-lasting series loved and completely threw all that out, instead adopting a dark, dystopian aesthetic with realistic graphics. You gotta hand it to them, it was a bold move, and veteran developers and publishers Hudson Soft and Konami surely realized that they would alienate a certain part of their fan base, but they must have calculated that if they delivered a high-quality experience that innovated and elevated the tried-and-true Bomberman formula, the series would reach heights never before seen. Except they didn't. And it didn't. The gameplay is tedious and repetitive, with a 99-level single-player mode lacking a save feature, forcing players to finish it all in one grueling session. Critics also slammed its long loading times, poor collision detection, and forgettable soundtrack. The removal of local multiplayer, which had been a franchise hallmark for an online-only mode, especially enraged fans. Technical flaws, like the awkward third-person camera angles in the misnamed first-person Bomberman mode and unbalanced AI, compounded the issues. In the end, Hudson Soft's push for a gritty, hardcore appeal failed, delivering a product that neither innovated nor honored its legacy, resulting in a critical and commercial disaster. Vampire Reign was marketed as a survival horror game and a stealth game at the peak of that genre's success in the 2000s, amidst series like Metal Gear Solid, Hitman, and Assassin's Creed. In the game, players controlled John Lloyd, a member of an elite special forces unit tasked with infiltrating a vampire-infested Los Angeles to eliminate the Nightwalkers and uncover the source of their outbreak. Vampire Reign deviates from the typical stealth action games by placing an unrelenting, often frustrating emphasis on pure stealth, leaving little room for error or alternative approaches. Enemies are not just challenging, but overwhelmingly fast and lethal, able to kill the player in just 2 hits, with the first hit usually immobilizing the player, making the second fatal blow almost inevitable. In the early stages, players are woefully under-equipped, lacking any practical weaponry to effectively combat vampires without burning through scarce ammunition. This imbalance means that any attempt to engage in combat is typically a death sentence, forcing players to rely solely on the stealth mechanic. Unlike most stealth games, which offer ways to recover from mistakes, Vampire Reign provides virtually no effective means of hiding or escaping once detected, leading to swift and unavoidable death. As a result, completing missions often feels less like skillful stealth and more like tedious trial and error, requiring players to memorize exact routes to avoid enemies entirely, a design that can feel more punishing than rewarding. Making matters worse, the AI was considered subpar, the controls are clunky, and the multiplayer is uninspired, all leading to the game's failure to catch on. In 2009, Paradox Interactive, the famous Swedish publisher and developer, world-renowned for series like Europa Universalis and Hearts of Iron, announced the creation of a new label focused on digital distribution of indie titles. The label launched with 2 titles, one of which was the parody RTS game Stalin vs. Martians. Developers Blackwing Foundation, Dreamlore, and Endgame, that's right, apparently it took 3 dev studios to create this game, have you take control of the infamous Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and his Red Army and pit you against Martians from outer space. According to Alexander Sherbakov, lead designer of the game, and I quote, "It is a purposely trashy game. That's quite unusual. It is a game that really mocks the World War II strategies." Unfortunately, even when you set out to lampoon others in your genre, there's usually an expectation that the game you create will be fun, and for critics and players, this one wasn't. The missions are boring, the balancing is not well considered, and controls are unresponsive. The game was so bad it was quickly delisted from Steam. In case you're wondering, the other game announced by Paradox's Mesmer indie label at launch was a 2-player turn-based strategy game called Legio, which also flopped and was similarly delisted from Steam, signaling the end of the Mesmer label, which is a real shame because Paradox was way ahead of the curve promoting indie games on Steam way back in 2009. So unfortunate that the experiment ended in failure because it was such a cool concept for the time. Not every game that flopped in the 2000s was necessarily a bad game. Some developers bravely tried something new or different, only to find that either they were way ahead of their time or couldn't break out of a small niche fan base. Here are some of the games that weren't afraid to take a risk, even if it didn't pan out. It's 2008 and you're watching E3 on YouTube. Just kidding, you're probably watching it on TV on the G4 network or maybe via a low quality stream on IGN's website or something. At any rate, you're watching Nintendo's E3 presentation and you're probably thinking, who is this woman and where's Reggie? She seems excited though, so let's give her the benefit of the doubt. They're showing the Wii balance board. Shaun White is there. It's kinda cringe, but okay. There's also Wii Fit. Mom will be thrilled to hear about that one maybe. They're talking about a new Animal Crossing game. That'll be fun for some easygoing relaxation. Oh, there he is, Reggie Fils-Aimé, finally. He's hyping up Nintendo's financial results. Alright, moving on to some games. There's Star Wars, Call of Duty, Rabbids, a Spore Creature game for the DS, that's sort of interesting I guess. The Wii Motion Plus is featured, okay, that's fine. But when are they gonna get to the real exciting content? Where are the big game-changing, industry-shaking announcements? Hold on, Reggie's building up something here. They're going over Wii Sports Resort, that seems okay. But wait, one more announcement he says. This one's gonna be big. In fact, they're gonna bring out the man himself, Shigeru Miyamoto. But what is this wild man gesticulating about? And what is that horrible noise? And then it slowly dawns on you. The big announcement. This is it. Miyamoto is playing a Wii remote as a pretend flute. Nintendo's huge keynote event at this year's E3 is Wii Music. Fans were pretty disappointed, but one thing was clear, Nintendo really wanted this game to succeed. So much so that some of you might be surprised that this made a list of flops. After all, didn't the game sell millions of copies? Well, it's true that Wii Music did sell just over 2.5 million copies. Consider that Wii Play sold 28 million copies. Wii Fit with the cringe Shaun White balance board sold 23 million copies. Even Wii Party sold over 9 million, more than 3 times as many copies as Wii Music. Heck, Wii Sports Resort announced that the very same 2008 E3 presentation would go on to sell an impressive 33 million copies. Expectations for first-party titles in the Wii series of games were very high, and so were the financial investments put towards their development and marketing. So when it ended the year as only the 30th best-selling game in Japan and didn't do any better in the West, the facts became undeniable. Wii Music was a flop. Where Nintendo thought the gameplay and controls were innovative and unique, gamers and critics saw them instead as gimmicky. The idea of using your imagination to bring the joy and creativity of musicianship to your home without the expensive music lessons just didn't resonate with people. In 2000 and 2001, Acclaim Entertainment and developer Z-Axis released a short series of BMX games endorsed by the famous American biker Dave Mirra, very much in the vein of Activision's Tony Hawk Pro Skater games. The games were a success, so all was looking well as they embarked on Dave Mirra Freestyle BMX 3 in late 2001. However, the action sports genre was starting to look a little crowded and the suits at Acclaim were starting to get nervous, so they started looking for ways to stand out and differentiate the next title in the series. What they landed on was one of the weirder turns that a series of games about doing bike tricks could have taken. The introduction of nudity and off-color sexual humor, aiming for some edginess and greater appeal among older teens and young adults. There was even a scene featuring real-life live-action strippers that you could unlock. Initially, Mirra himself was apparently on board with the concept, but following the unveiling at E3 and seeing the reaction there, he pulled his endorsement. Despite this, Acclaim went ahead and continued to use his name and likeness to promote the game, or so he claimed in a lawsuit he filed in February 2003. Piling on, Acclaim's own shareholders also sued, claiming they were misled about the company's plans to veer into mature-themed games. The lawsuits were eventually all settled, but the cost for Acclaim, both financially and as a serious distraction and PR nightmare, directly resulted in the bankruptcy of the company in 2004. As for the game, apparently it wasn't actually all that bad. The gameplay was on par with earlier entries in the series, though they failed to deliver much that was new apart from the thematic shift. But given the M ratings limiting of the potential audience, the legal distractions, and the lack of celebrity endorsement, the game was a huge flop commercially. The final game ever to be released by storied German developer Factor 5, Layer has you assume the role of John Partridge, a dragon-riding knight who begins to doubt his nation's righteousness in a war between two rival factions. Reported to have cost about $25 million to develop, Layer impressed with its stunning visuals and art direction, and its unique dragon-riding mechanic let players switch between aerial and ground combat, offering fresh gameplay variety. A cinematic story of betrayal and redemption, backed by an orchestral score, rounded out its appeal. One of the game's standout features, at least in the eyes of the developers at launch, is the pioneering use of the PS3 controller's 6-axis motion controls, where you control the dragons flying by physically tilting the controller. That sounds simple, but it took an amazing 6 pages of the 21-page instruction booklet just to describe the controls, inviting players to, quote, open your mind and hands for something very different. It was a risky bet going with such a novel concept for such a high-budget game, and the bet didn't pay off. Gamers didn't love the 6-axis controls. In fact, they hated them so much it completely overshadowed any positives about the game. This made the game a serious disappointment for those who bought the high-profile title. To their credit, about a year later, Factor 5 recognized the blunder and put work into adding analog stick support into the game via a PSN update. But this was too little too late to save Layer and the studio from their fates. Psychonauts is a 3D platformer and was the debut game for Double Fine Studios, which had just recently been founded by legendary former LucasArts employee Tom Schafer, who had designed or co-designed many critically acclaimed games such as Day of the Tentacle, Grim Fandango, and Full Throttle. The game has a unique and innovative mechanic of entering and exploring the minds of characters, creating surreal levels that reflect their inner thoughts. This psychological twist on platforming, combined with psychic abilities like telekinesis and levitation, offers fresh gameplay. Its humor, clever writing, and detailed art direction further enhance its appeal, making it a memorable experience. Despite critical acclaim, the game initially sold poorly, shipping fewer than 100,000 copies in North America by the end of the year. Its quirky, offbeat style and focus on mental health themes were definitely ahead of the times, appealing to a smaller, dedicated audience. Over time, though, digital re-releases helped it gain a cult following. In 2011, full rights to the game reverted to Double Fine Studios after a publishing deal with Majesco expired. This enabled them to significantly expand the distribution of the game via new channels like Humble Bundle, Steam, and GOG. By this time, the game had enough of a cult following to encourage serious word of mouth, and Psychonauts finally got the recognition and commercial success, late though it was, that it deserved. Published by EA, Majestic was an incredibly innovative game that attempted to launch an entire genre, the self-supporting alternate reality game. Says creator Neil Young, I was looking at the internet at that time and trying to seek out interactive entertainment and couldn't find any. I didn't feel like there was anything created specifically for the medium. Majestic blurred the lines between the game and reality, using real-world communication methods like phone calls and emails to involve players directly. This made the game feel like a personal conspiracy, with the tagline, "It plays you," capturing its immersive approach. Basically, the game's story would unfold over various real-life communication channels. So for instance, you get a pre-recorded message as a phone call, sometimes at odd times of day like 3 a.m., or an email or fax might come in with clues to story elements. Websites were set up that were also part of the game, or you can even have real-time interactions with the characters via AOL Instant Messenger. A tremendously interesting concept that even won Best Original Game at E3 2001, among many other accolades. Unfortunately, the difficulty explaining such a concept to the wider gaming public of 2001, combined with a pretty steep $10 a month subscription fee, made the game a tough sell. The final nail in the coffin came less than 2 months after release on September 11th, when the game had to be put on pause as its conspiracy themes and blended reality was considered in poor taste given the circumstances. As a result of all this, the game never took off and failed commercially, leading to EA pulling the plug in mid-2002. Auto Assault, released in 2006, was a game that combined vehicular combat with MMORPG elements, making it definitely a bit of a trailblazer for the era. The game was set in a dystopian sci-fi world reminiscent of the Mad Max series, featuring 3 factions, humans, mutants, and biomechs, each with distinct characteristics. Players could customize their vehicles, such as cars, motorcycles, and tanks, which was central to the gameplay. The focus on vehicular combat rather than character-based fighting was rare for MMOs at the time, a novelty the game hang its hat on in a fairly crowded field of MMOs. It introduced several innovative features like a complex crafting system for building and upgrading vehicles, and a combat system where players could mount multiple weapons and strategize their attacks. Notably, there was no death penalty, allowing you to die without losing progress, which encouraged risk-taking and experimentation. The game also included instance layers for both PvP and non-PvP activities, adding variety to the gameplay and catering to different types of players. There's always an issue with having games like this where you stack niches on top of each other. So effectively here you have an MMO that only appeals to some players, and a Mad Max-style vehicular combat game, which is a surprisingly small niche as it turns out as well, and the overlap between the two make it hard to build a solid player base. The game itself wasn't perfect either, with some performance issues and graphics that did leave something to be desired, leading to the game's closure after only a year. Tabula Rasa was another unique MMORPG, this one set in an interesting sci-fi setting and designed by none other than Richard Garriott, who you'll perhaps remember as the creator of the Ultima series, featured in our first video on flops of the 90s with the ill-fated Ultima 9. The game blended shooter elements with traditional MMORPG elements, featuring sticky targeting and dice rolling based on character stats, adjustable for factors like weapon type and cover. The dynamic battlefield had NPC forces battling over control points, and which faction had control of different areas had big effects on player access to facilities and missions. Players could influence the outcomes of these NPC battles through their participation. The system and the game overall were well received by critics, though the fast-paced and complex gameplay did make the game difficult to get into for some gamers. The hugely ambitious and unique scale of the game, though, cost a pretty penny to create, with a budget of $25 million. Mind you, that figure is a little misleading because the game had actually started as an entirely different one that had to be restarted almost from scratch 2 years into development. You see, Garriott was convinced that they could create a global IP using Asian styling, but after years of trying, it was finally explained by his Asian partners that the idea of a Western company pulling off an Asian aesthetic successfully will probably never happen. Garriott recalled in an interview his partner telling him this, paraphrasing, "You know what? When you guys try to do Asian pagodas or Asian armor or weapons, it never feels domestic. It always feels like a foreigner making stuff for us. Imagine we were going to do a European castle. Instead of making the stone walls nice and straight, we'd make them sort of like an inflatable castle, slightly curved, like a marshmallow castle. We might not notice that it doesn't look like a good castle, but you would immediately notice that it was cartoony versus strong and powerful." So they totally went back to basics and started over, but this time under significant corporate pressure to turn something around quickly. This all contributed to delivering a game that the famed developer himself admitted was less than he hoped for, and 15 months later the game was shut down due to a low player base. When Sacrifice came out in 2000, it bent genres in a way that made it hard to define. Billed as an RTS, it differed from most in the genre by emphasizing combat instead of resource gathering, with one of two critical resources, souls, being captured from enemies. The game let players act as both commander and combatant, controlling wizards who can cast over 50 spells and summon a variety of creatures. Sacrifice has an interesting cartoon-like art style which uses, at the time, advanced 256-bit textures, creating a visually striking fantasy world. This world is ruled by 5 gods, each with distinct characteristics, and players can choose allegiances, adding depth to the narrative. The game also features some humorous elements that are fondly remembered by fans, with memorable voice acting and in-jokes like the bovine intervention spell. Critics praised the game, especially for its freshness, but one complaint that came up pretty frequently was the difficulty. Designer Eric Flanham admitted later that Sacrifice has more of a difficulty wall than a difficulty curve, harder than we realized as we'd gotten over the curve. He also mentioned, from the visual style, from the lack of a disembodied camera, RTS players especially had a lot of new concepts to wrap themselves around. So the difficulty level and genre-bending niche gameplay relegated this game to forgotten gem status almost immediately after it released. Bionic Commando is an action-adventure game and the 6th in a series that began way back in 1987 with Capcom's original arcade title. Thus, it was a surprise for many when the game became Capcom's first flop in the high-definition era. The game is notable for its bionic arm mechanic, which enables players to swing, climb, and attack dynamically, offering a fresh take on action-adventure games. This mechanic, which was central to the experience of the game, allows targeting enemies while hanging or mid-swing, and even launching objects like boulders or cars. The game's level design is tightly focused, with large linear levels that create a cohesive world, enhancing the sense of mastery and engagement. While it was marketed as an open-world game, in reality it unfolds in a fairly linear way, with blocks established that limited exploration at certain points of the game. This unfortunately disappointed a lot of people, and resulted in accusations of misleading marketing. Difficulty getting into the bionic arm mechanic and the strangeness of some of the story twists, like the reveal that the protagonist's wife is actually part of his bionic arm, also made the game a little too niche to succeed widely. Crush is a 2007 puzzle platforming game developed by Zoe Mode. The puzzle platform genre has always been a little bit of a niche category, though occasionally breakout hits do happen, such as with Nintendo's Captain Toad Treasure Tracker or Valve's Portal, which released in the same year as Crush. The unique twist on the formula offered by Crush is the blending of 2D and 3D modes where you switch between them to solve the puzzle. This feature, conceived by Zoe Mode in 2002, was ahead of its time and praised for creativity. The game also features interactive elements like crushing blocks to create obstacles or platforms, and time-based challenges with alarm clocks. These add a little bit of strategic depth. The game was critically acclaimed, but as Paul Mottram, Zoe Mode's executive producer, said shortly after release, positive reception of the game did not translate into high sales, but the game will hopefully stick around for a while and continue to shift units. Mottram got his wish, sort of, with the game making a return for the 3DS 5 years later. Unfortunately, if it was ahead of its time when it initially launched for the PSP, the opposite was true in 2012, and the re-release largely went unnoticed. Culdcept Saga is a hybrid game that combines elements of board games like Monopoly with trading card game mechanics. Players roll dice to move around the game board, using cards to summon creatures, cast spells, and deploy items to claim territories and collect tolls. This fusion makes the game feel unique by offering a strategic depth that feels both accessible and yet challenging, appealing to both casual and dedicated players. With over 500 different cards available, but limited to 50 per deck, deck building becomes a key strategic element, encouraging players to plan carefully before matches. The online multiplayer support via Xbox Live, with leaderboards and rankings for up to 4 players, was notable for its time and added some competitive appeal. Despite these strengths, Culdcept Saga is considered a niche player due to several factors. Its complex and slow-paced gameplay, combined with an element of luck from dice rolls and card draws, deterred casual players, while its depth appealed to smaller, strategy-focused audiences. Due to the disappointing sales, Culdcept Saga would be the final time developer Omiyasoft would try a new Culdcept release on a home console, though the series did continue with 3 more games in the 2010s on handhelds. An action RPG published by Squaresoft in 2000, expectations were high for Vagrant Story. Developed by the team behind Final Fantasy Tactics, the developers weren't afraid to take a risk and innovate a little, doing away with some traditional RPG elements like shops and extensive character interactions in favor of innovative gameplay like platforming and puzzle solving, a rare element in the genre. Combat is also a little different. Players can target specific enemy body parts using a spherical grid, chain together attacks with rhythm-like timing, and manage a risk meter that affects defense. While none of these elements were totally new inventions, the way they were combined together resulted in something pretty innovative. The game presents its story in a graphic novel format with comic-style dialogue bubbles and dramatic cutscenes. The plot, centered around Ashley Riot, an elite agent investigating a conspiracy in the ruined city of Leamond, is inspired by 1950 Japanese film Rashomon, offering multiple versions of the protagonist's past. This non-linear narrative, revealed through a prologue and flashbacks, adds complexity and confusion by design, enhancing replayability. Critics absolutely loved the game, pretty much everything about it. Famitsu even gave it an extremely rare 40 out of 40 perfect score. Unfortunately, some of the things that made the game so unique and beloved also hurt its commercial viability. Traditional RPG fans missed the elements they'd become accustomed to in series like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, and combat systems were difficult to master, especially for more casual gamers. But because of its fiercely dedicated fan base and the overwhelming critical acclaim, the game has become a cult classic that resonates with an ever-increasing number of people to this day. A superhero-themed real-time tactical RPG, and the second game developed by Irrational Games after the disappointing System Shock 2 in 1999, Freedom Force was definitely unique when it released in 2002. The game is set in 1962 Patriot City, capturing a Silver Age comic book aesthetic with campy narration and cinematic character backstories. Players can interact with the environment in interesting ways, such as using cars and telephone booths as weapons, and the extensive character creation system allows for personalized superhero designs, enabling creative scenarios like Marvel vs. DC battles. The game received universal critical acclaim and was generally loved by the players who gave it a shot. But anytime you blend two things together, even if it seems great to you, you can't guarantee mainstream success will follow. Sometimes you get peanut butter and jelly, and other times you end up with wasabi ice cream. Such was the case here, where it just didn't seem like there was a lot of widespread demand for a superhero-themed tactics RPG. So despite, or perhaps partially because of, a modest $2 million budget, the game failed to achieve enough commercial success for publishers EA or 2K Games to agree to a sequel. But Irrational Games, emboldened by all the critical and fan reception, forged ahead and self-published a sequel, Freedom Force vs. the Third Reich. The game was well received, if a little less so than its predecessor. Both games maintain a cult following to this day, each even enjoying a vibrant modding community to help keep things fresh. Set on an alternate version of Earth in the 21st century, Killer 7 follows the Smith Syndicate, a group of 7 assassins with unique abilities led by Harmon Smith as they battle the Heaven Smile terrorist group and uncover a complex conspiracy involving political intrigue and supernatural forces. The story unfolds through surreal, episodic missions, blending intense action and psychological horror in a stylized, cel-shaded world. Even though they generally viewed the game favorably, critics immediately pointed out its niche appeal, with a review in Eurogamer saying that Killer 7 was never an everyman's game. A lot of attention was focused on the game's unique on-rails control scheme, where player movement is restricted to predetermined paths, a design choice that drew comparisons to adventure games like Myst and Snatcher, but with first-person shooter elements. The complex plot, exploring US-Japanese relations and political conspiracies, definitely adds an intellectual layer, but doesn't exactly scream mass appeal. Hiroyuki Kobayashi, the producer, explicitly stated in an interview, "I didn't think it would sell, and it didn't, so I was disappointed." While this may be true, it's also undeniable that Killer 7 is a cult classic that could do with a sequel or at least a remaster, something both fans and creator Goichi Suda have expressed a lot of interest in. A demonic society is attempting to resurrect a demon king, and the only one who can stop them is a young man who holds the power of God in his hand. His God hand. The simultaneously over-the-top and silly, yet totally badass and epic plot perfectly encapsulates what gamers should expect from this game, the final game to ever be released by Capcom's Clover Studio. God Hand is a beat-em-up game whose uniqueness lies in its in-depth and heavily customizable combat system, as well as one-of-a-kind humor and style. While it's true that a game like this might never have achieved widespread commercial success due to its quirkiness and generally hardcore nature, God Hand was relegated to flop status, at least during its initial launch, due largely to a single extremely critical review in IGN. While other publications were somewhat mixed but skewed positive, IGN's Chris Roper gave the game an absolutely abysmal 3 out of 10. Those familiar with the game lambasted Roper for his review, which was plainly based on either an embarrassing lack of any ability to grasp gaming concepts or a laziness betrayed by an obvious unfamiliarity with the game. For example, Roper claimed that the game encouraged mindless button mashing, but in reality it has a deep and highly customizable combat system. Indeed, arguably too much so in the eyes of some beginners. The tone of the review also indicated, for many readers, a certain preconceived bias and a lack of open-mindedness that was unfair to Clover on their final outing. Well, to be fair, some of Roper's criticisms, including graphical flaws and frustrating camera angles, might not have been totally baseless. Some fans blame him for the game's initial failure, though this didn't stop it from achieving cult classic status in the long run. The first ever first-party published Nintendo game to feature an M rating, Eternal Darkness released in 2002 to high praise by critics, but underperformed commercially, selling less than 500,000 copies globally, which is a serious disappointment by Nintendo standards. Eternal Darkness is one of the first games to pioneer a fully fleshed out, player-centric sanity system, building on earlier attempts like 1989's Sweet Home, where the character's sanity meter decreases when encountering enemies, triggering hallucinations like bleeding walls or a skewed camera. The effects even broke the fourth wall, such as simulating console errors or appearing as though the game is deleting your save files, making players question reality, a rare and innovative mechanic at the time. The game's psychological thriller approach, inspired by Lovecraftian horror, focuses on mental engagement rather than traditional jump scares, setting it apart from survival horror games. Its multiple story paths, determined by early choices, offer replayability, revealing simultaneous timelines. However, some of these innovative elements might have been too avant-garde for mainstream audiences, contributing to its niche status. As Canadian lead developer Dennis Dyack of Silicon Knights put it, video games were under fire for messing with people's heads and being accused of being murder simulators and stuff. So we thought, wouldn't it be a good idea to make something that really does mess with people's heads? though he'd also admit that this concept might have been ahead of its time, judging by reactions from some players and by Nintendo themselves. Attempts at sequels have faced consistent challenges, mostly in the form of unrelated legal troubles, and it looks like fans may never be able to return to this fascinating universe. Rez should have been released in HD, it should have been a downloadable game, and it should have come out in 2008. These are the words of Sam Kennedy writing for 1UP magazine in his 2008 review of the freshly re-released Rez for the Xbox 360, lamenting the lack of attention the original received when it came out for the Dreamcast and PS2 in 2001. Rez is a musical rail shooter that seamlessly integrates traditional shooter mechanics with interactive music, creating a synesthetic experience where player actions directly influence the soundtrack and visuals. This blend was totally unlike other contemporary games like Parappa the Rapper, Frequency, or Bust a Groove, which focused entirely on strict rhythm-based gameplay. Rez's quantization mechanic allows players of any skill level to interact musically, incorporating mistakes into the score, making it accessible yet still rewarding for those who can accomplish precision. The game's narrative is conveyed without dialogue, relying on abstract visuals and music to tell the story of a hacker's journey into a malfunctioning AI system. This minimalist approach, with thematic references to life's journey and technological singularity, gives Rez a distinctive storytelling style. Rez was innovative for its time by treating gameplay as a means to create music rather than simply accompanying it, a concept that was revolutionary in 2001. In an interview in 2015 with Eurogamer, producer Tetsuya Mizuguchi shared that he initially thought Rez might be a big hit, but the sales were not as good as expected, leading to feelings of depression. He'd later go on to produce a spiritual successor, Children of Eden, published by Ubisoft in 2011, and although this one performed a little better than Rez, the concept was nevertheless still not the hit that Mizuguchi was convinced that it should be. Standing out for its blending of third-person shooter and real-time strategy, Giant's Citizen Kabuto combines fast-paced action with strategic depth, letting players control 3 races: the mechs, which are basically space machines with jetpacks, Sea Reapers, magical water people, and Kabuto, a giant monster. Each race has its own campaign and unique abilities, like Kabuto's wrestling moves, and the RTS elements come in with resource management and base building. Attempting to merge the two worlds of quick reflex shooting and macro strategic RTS is no small feat, which is why so few games have tried it over the years, but Giants pulled it off quite well and also benefits from smart-looking graphics, though these are admittedly very much a product of the time in retrospect, and a brand of humor that's all its own, sort of a Shrek meets Conker's Bad Fur Day with clever innuendos, slapstick, and some gross-out elements. The game didn't catch on, and initial sales were very poor with just over 10,000 in the first 6 months, but it did build a considerable fan base over time, so much so that in 2015, one of the designers of the game, Nick Brody, who had since moved on to create his own studio, launched a Kickstarter campaign to develop a spiritual successor, though it failed to reach its goal. In the late 90s, with the Austin Powers series at its peak of popularity, American PC developer Monolith Productions saw an opening for a unique take on the FPS genre, blending stealth and humor with a 1960s spy theme. Thus was born No One Lives Forever, following the story of Kate Archer, a spy on a global mission to stop the terrorist group HARM. One of the game's interesting features is the use of gadgets like a lock-picking hair barrette and exploding lipstick, cleverly disguised as fashion items like they would be in a campy 60s spy movie. The humor, including visual gags and absurd villains, adds a lighthearted tone, while critics and players alike appreciated the surprisingly advanced AI that reacted well to player actions like footsteps and gunfire. Critical response, especially for the PC version, was through the roof, winning multiple Game of the Year awards and even earning favorable comparisons to Half-Life and Deus Ex. But sales were disappointing, especially for a major publisher like Fox. In an article in April 2001, PC Gamer called the failure to launch a tragedy and noted that it was tough to nail down a specific reason why more people didn't just buy into the idea. But the critical response and slow building of a cult following encouraged Monolith to give it another try with a sequel a couple years later. No One Lives Forever 2 also gained critical acclaim, but unfortunately also failed to catch on with mainstream audiences. If you were a teen or young adult in the 2000s decade, you probably know the name Harmonix. The hugely successful studio behind Rock Band and Guitar Hero later in the decade began life in a lot more humble way in 2001's Frequency. Co-founder of Harmonix, Aaron Agozi, said in a 2008 interview, "Our original mission statement was to bring the joy of music making to everyone out there in the world who may not necessarily have all the experience that comes from having learned a real musical instrument." To which the other founding member added, "It was a really hard lesson for us to realize that making a fun game just isn't enough for a game developer. We had to start thinking about making games that were easier to sell." Indeed, critics and players all agreed that Frequency was a fun game, but a few things were standing in the way of breakout success. Rhythm games were were still a pretty niche genre, the music selection offered little by way of mainstream appeal, marketing and distribution were lacking, and critically, the precise button inputs required by the game weren't well suited to even the most advanced controllers like the DualShock 2. In fact, Microsoft had been pitched on the game and had passed, with Ed Fries, VP of Game Publishing, bluntly telling Harmonix that nobody would ever buy a music rhythm game without a custom piece of hardware attached to it. When Alex Rogopoulos ran into Fries a few years later, after the success of Guitar Hero, he reminded him of their earlier interaction. To which the Microsoft VP replied, "Well, thanks for that. Thanks for giving me some amount of credit for that. I wish we had actually signed you and done it." I'm sure many others wish the same, because both Guitar Hero and Rock Band would of course go on to become multi-billion-dollar franchises. Oni is a third-person action/shooter game developed by Bungie for release in 2001. Oni's most defining feature is its seamless integration of melee combat and third-person shooting, allowing players to fluidly switch between martial arts-inspired punches, kicks, and throws and a variety of firearms like pistols, rifles, and energy weapons. The melee system is particularly innovative, drawing inspiration from fighting games like Street Fighter but adapted to a third-person perspective. Players have to manually aim their attacks without auto-lock, requiring precision and timing, which adds a layer of skill uncommon in action games of the era. This lack of auto-targeting makes combat feel more deliberate and rewarding, though it can be punishing if misjudged. Combat with this kind of depth and complexity can be a double-edged sword though, no pun intended. If you're not careful, you can end up locking yourself into a niche of particularly dedicated gamers. Bungie knew this too, with head of PR Doug Zartman saying in an interview, "Oni has great potential in the game market, but it's mainly aimed at hardcore action gamers, those who play Unreal and Quake. If Oni has the same success in the mainstream like Tomb Raider had, I don't know." As it turned out, players were intimidated by the hardcore nature of the game, and this combined with cut features, especially multiplayer, made this one a pass for most people. Bungie wouldn't have to wait long for their big hit to come though, with none other than Halo Combat Evolved coming out the same year. Sometimes, games that might have otherwise become big blockbuster hits flop through circumstances that are largely beyond their control. Maybe the timing wasn't right, maybe the marketing fell flat, or maybe the competition was just better. This next category includes games that were simply casualties of fate. After the flop of Daikatana a little more than a year earlier, developer Ion Storm had learned their lesson. You can't just spend big money on marketing a lackluster game and expect massive success to follow. Unfortunately, the pendulum seems to have swung a little too far in the other direction, because for Anachronox, millions of dollars was dedicated to development, but only around $50,000 was put towards marketing. This meant that when the game came out in June 2001, it went almost entirely unnoticed, and that is a crying shame because critics and fans both agree that the Chrono Trigger-inspired RPG deserved a lot better. Set on the planet Anachronox, an abandoned artificial alien planet now home to low-lifes, thieves, and scoundrels, the game follows Sylvester Boots, a down-on-his-luck PI, and his companions as they investigate a galaxy-crushing mystery involving artifacts from an extinct alien race. The game blends turn-based combat with interesting real-time twists, like letting players move characters and manage action points for attacks, items, and positioning. This tactical depth, paired with the Mistech special ability system and cinematic storytelling with quirky characters, really sets the game apart from the pack. Ion Storm CEO Todd Porter had publicly expected Anachronox and Daikatana together to ship over 2.5 million copies, so when the former failed to sell even 2% of that in the first 4 months, the flop was so embarrassing it led almost immediately to the closure of the studio, though its Austin office would remain in place to at least finish out their work on Deus Ex Invisible War and Thief Deadly Shadows, two games that were actually fairly well received, though not well enough to save the company from its demise. Producer James Poole of IDOS later said of the whole situation, "That's the worst thing about Ion Storm. Anachronox got lost in the clusterfuck." Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness marked a significant evolution for the franchise, attempting to redefine Lara Croft's adventure with a darker, more mature storyline. This narrative shift involved Lara as a fugitive accused of murdering her mentor, Werner von Croy, and entangled in a conspiracy involving a sinister alchemist and the Obscura paintings. The game also introduced new gameplay mechanics, notably stealth elements which let Lara sidle against walls and perform neckbreaker attacks a la Solid Snake from the Metal Gear series. While these additions weren't necessarily universally praised, they were seen as an honest and badly needed attempt to diversify gameplay. Music and sound design are standout features, receiving high praise across reviews. IGN highlighted the game as beautifully scored, enhancing the dramatic mood, while Eurogamer claimed it was the best in the series, with atmospheric effects and first-rate voice acting contributing to immersion. Despite these strengths, the Angel of Darkness faced considerable development difficulties that undermined its potential. Delays caused by overambition and a lack of leadership meant a rushed release, and certain parts of the game like the Paris area appeared incomplete. It also didn't help that the delays meant a release alongside competitors like The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, Grand Theft Auto Vice City, Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic, and Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, all of which received high praise and strong sales. All this meant that when this entry in the franchise came out, it failed to live up to expectations, both in commercial and critical response. Core Design, the developer who had founded the series way back in 1996, would never create another Tomb Raider game again. Another game developed by the doomed Silicon Knights, a developer studio featured earlier in this video, Too Human is an action role-playing game that uniquely combines science fiction with Norse mythology. Players take on the role of Baldur, a cybernetically enhanced god tasked with protecting humanity from Loki's machine army. It's an interesting setup for a game, and the studio mostly pulled it off, with the game's immersion boosted by excellent detail and lighting and a co-op multiplayer function via Xbox Live that appealed to players seeking a shared experience. Released in 2008, Too Human entered a competitive market on the Xbox 360, facing established titles like Gears of War and Halo, which may have overshadowed it. On top of this, Dennis Dyack, the lead designer, was a controversial figure, often trolling forums and sparring with critics. For example, he bragged on the NeoGAF forum that he'd get at least 70 or 80 on this game on Metacritic, or else he'd allow himself to be tagged with "owned by the GAF." After some back and forth, he actually ended up getting himself perma-banned from the forum. Love him or hate him, having your lead developer out there acting like this probably had an impact on the game's and ultimately the studio's success. Making matters worse, during development, Silicon Knights sued Epic Games, alleging that Epic provided an inadequate version of the Unreal Engine, which they claimed hindered progress. Epic countersued, alleging that Silicon Knights used copyrighted code from Epic in their own engine after abandoning Unreal. Silicon Knights lost the lawsuit, and as a result were required to recall all copies of Too Human in 2012, severely limiting its availability and cementing its status as a flop. A hybrid action-adventure RTS game, Brutal Legend stands out for its vibrant, over-the-top world that feels like it's ripped straight from a Frank Frazetta painting or a classic heavy metal album cover. Players control Eddie Riggs, a roadie voiced by Jack Black, who's transported to a fantasy realm of chrome, leather, and fire-breathing beasts. The voice cast also featured several metal legends, including Lenny Kilmister, Rob Halford, Lita Ford, and Ozzy Osbourne, whose performances added authenticity mixed with some fun humor. The marketing for the game, handled by publisher EA, focused a lot on the hack-and-slash elements, leading many to expect a straightforward action game like God of War, so when they encountered the RTS elements that came in mainly later in the campaign, a lot of people were confused or even frustrated. EA's attempt to broaden the game's appeal also diluted its metal identity, with TV ads downplaying the heavy metal vibe and the star-studded cameos instead of leaning into them. But a marketing miss was the least of this game's problems. Brutal Legend's development was a chaotic saga. Initially signed with Vivendi Games, the project's scope ballooned, causing delays. After Vivendi merged with Activision, the new CEO Bobby Kotick dropped the game, citing missed deadlines and funding issues. This caught developer Double Fine completely by surprise, as they themselves only learned of the cancellation through a press release. EA picked up the game, but Activision sued, claiming their ongoing negotiations with Double Fine invalidated the deal with EA. Double Fine countersued, saying Activision abandoned the project and harmed the game's success, with CEO Tim Schafer famously saying, "Hey, if Activision liked it, then they should have put a ring on it. Oh great, now Beyonce's gonna sue me too." The lawsuits were eventually settled, but not before they took a big toll on Schafer as well as the game itself. Directed by Michael Ansel, the creator of Rayman, Beyond Good and Evil was envisioned as the first part of a trilogy about Jade, a photojournalist, martial artist, and spy who navigates the planet Hillis to uncover an alien conspiracy. Like Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness, Beyond Good and Evil took a lot of inspiration from series like Metal Gear Solid, while adding in a dash of Zelda and a heaping spoonful of Pokemon Snap. That's right, the most defining feature of this game for many people is the unique photography system, setting it apart from other adventure games of the era. Praised by critics and even garnering several Game of the Year nominations, the game was nevertheless a flop for Ubisoft, who just couldn't figure out how to market it, with official US PlayStation Magazine saying in their positive review of the game, the lack of marketing from Ubisoft and the game's odd premise naturally reserved it to obscurity. Trilogy hopes were dashed pretty much immediately, but a full HD remaster in 2011 did do a little better. However, this was too little too late to make much difference in the game's overall success. It did do well enough to continue working on a sequel, which as of 2025 is apparently still in development, holding the record now as the longest development period ever for a AAA game, even longer than 2011's Duke Nukem Forever. Published by Sega, Viking Battle for Asgard is an action-adventure and hack-and-slash hybrid set in the vivid world of Norse mythology. You play as Skarin, a Viking warrior chosen by the goddess Freya to battle the forces of the goddess of death as she seeks to unleash Ragnarok by freeing the wolf god Fenrir. The massive battles involving hundreds of warriors, a hallmark of developer Creative Assembly's popular game series Total War, were a huge draw. These climactic encounters are visually spectacular, with dragons soaring overhead and fireballs raining down from the sky, and the ability to summon dragons for devastating attacks adds a thrilling layer of strategy. Open world exploration, uncommon of hack-and-slash titles of the era, is another plus. Unfortunately, with God of War 2 coming out the year before, the comparison between the two was drawn fairly immediately and perhaps unfairly, but such a comparison was always going to be unflattering when compared to a critically acclaimed mega blockbuster like God of War 2. Some of the criticisms of Battle for Asgard were reasonable though, such as missed opportunities by a developer largely unfamiliar with the genre. An example was lamented by James Sterling, writing for Destructoid, who said, "A game like this begs to have special weapons and treasure hidden all over the world, but gold is the only thing that you can find, and even then it's not all that useful." And so Battle for Asgard was largely overlooked, even to the extent that it earned a spot on Game Radar's retrospective 100 Most Overlooked Games of the Generation list. 2008's Dark Sector was a game 8 years in the making, beginning way back in 2000 as a follow-up to Unreal Tournament, and then in 2002 as a sci-fi third-person shooter. Developer Digital Extremes finally landed on a modern setting in Eastern Europe, shelving the sci-fi theme for a later project, which would become Warframe. Digital Extremes was spinning their wheels a little after mainly working on Unreal games alongside Epic for the preceding decade, putting them in a bit of a precarious work-for-hire position where they were totally reliant on partners who could cancel projects at any time. So with Dark Sector, they were really hoping to launch their own successful IP. Players assume the role of Hayden Tenno, a CIA operative infected by the Technocyte virus, which grants him superhuman abilities, including the ability to grow a 3-pronged glaive from his arm. The glaive is central to Dark Sector's appeal, functioning as a throwable blade that returned like a boomerang. It can also be steered with aftertouch for slow-motion kills, and enhanced with elemental effects like ice and fire for combat and puzzle solving. For example, it can unlock doors, open ammo crates, light torches, create ice columns, and so on, kind of like a Swiss Army knife that adds depth to both combat and exploration. The multiplayer has 2 interesting game modes, including the asymmetrical Infection mode with the protagonist Hayden versus up to 9 soldiers, and Epidemic, in which 2 teams each get a Hayden, and whoever's able to kill the other teams first is the winner. Interesting side note, the game was actually banned in Australia due to violence and had to be pulled for a year and re-released with a censored version later. But Dark Sector didn't exactly catch on outside of Australia either, a victim of fierce competition and a developer torn in two between earning a living and building something new. Many of the ideas from this attempt though made their way into what some consider a spiritual successor of sorts, 2013's Warframe, a game that itself suffered from a slow start but eventually turned things around and finally became the major IP that Digital Extremes had been searching for. In June 2003, Blizzard North executives Bill Roper, Max Schafer, Eric Schafer, and David Brevik emailed Blizzard Entertainment's then-parent company Vivendi Games threatening to resign unless they provided financial protections and communication on Vivendi's intent to sell Blizzard. Vivendi accepted their resignations effective immediately, spurring them to found flagship studios and recruit similarly disgruntled Blizzard North employees. Roper, Brevik, and the Schafers together had overseen the creation of major franchises Diablo, Warcraft, and StarCraft, so when they went independent, there was obviously a lot of attention paid to what they'd come up with. Their first game was Hellgate London in 2007. The game features 6 classes across 3 factions, Templars, Kabbalists, and Hunters, and allows switching between first-person and third-person perspectives, which was innovative for its time. Brevik billed it as Diablo 2 meets Half-Life, an incredibly appealing prospect for fans of both of those series or of computer gaming more generally. There was a free online mode appreciated by Diablo 2 players that had become accustomed to this service from Blizzard, but it was supplemented by an optional subscription service that had extras like hardcore mode or PvP ladder. The game was generally considered okay, and sales did crack 1 million copies, but given the reputation of flagship studios, expectations and hype levels were extremely high. So when the game launched with a lack of some of the same sort of polish you might expect from a Blizzard title, a result of financial constraints at the new studio, what might have been considered a great game by normal standards just sort of fizzled out. Thinking back, Bill Roper remarked, "The biggest failure with Hellgate was we tried to do too much. I think that was where our growing up Blizzard hurt us, right? Because at Blizzard, you just go for it. Every time you swing for the fences." They worked hard to bring the game up to high standards nonetheless, and within 6 months it was in a much better state, but by then the fanbase had moved on. Flagship started to work on another game, Mythos, but they ran out of money before they could finish it and closed down in 2008. One of the rare M-rated titles to come out for the Wii, Mad World is a beat-em-up hack-and-slash game known for its highly stylized black and white graphics, over-the-top violence, and visceral action, with a layer of irreverent comedy. Written by Yasumi Matsuno, known for Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story, the narrative explores violence as entertainment, set in a dystopian future where a game show involved infecting an entire island city with a deadly virus, and only those who killed another person would receive the vaccine. Critical reception was through the roof, with the only real criticisms being the game's relatively short length and at times imperfect camera. The game's use of the Wii's motion controls in a complex but intuitive way were praised, with actions like swinging the Wii remote to mimic on-screen violence like throwing enemies into jet engines or pulling controllers apart to break necks. This enhances immersion, with producer Atsushi Inaba saying in an interview that, "We've come to believe the Wii controller is actually more intuitive and more relevant for action games." Despite the critical success, the game was a commercial failure. While it may have succeeded on another console, the install base of the Wii was just very skewed towards family-friendly titles, and M-rated games struggled to gain a foothold. For some reason, after a session of Wii Sports bowling with Grandma, the next thought wasn't, "Hey, let's fire up Mad World and dismember some people with a chainsaw." Okami is an action-adventure game where you control Amaterasu, a wolf deity reincarnation of the sun goddess, on a quest to restore a world plagued by darkness using the Celestial Brush, a mechanic that lets players draw on the screen to solve puzzles, fight enemies, and interact with the environment. The game's critical success, especially for the PS2 version, was nothing short of sheer adulation. The visual presentation is perhaps the most distinctive aspect, employing an ink art style that mimics traditional Japanese brush painting. This style, described as breathtaking and beautiful in critic reviews, creates a hand-painted aesthetic that feels simultaneously timeless and yet innovative. The gameplay mechanics further enhance its uniqueness, centered around the Celestial Brush. Using this, you could change day to night, create wind, and paint things into existence to solve puzzles. Winning IGN's Game of the Year award among many other accolades, and even holds a Guinness World Record for the most critically acclaimed video game starring an animal character. Boy, they really do get creative with these records sometimes, don't they? The game nonetheless flopped commercially, earning yet another dubious Guinness record in 2010, least commercially successful winner of a Game of the Year award. At the core of the problem for Okami was that its uniqueness made it tough to market. Capcom tried some unconventional techniques like art contests, but it was a tough sell, especially for a game releasing at the very end of the PS2's lifecycle, coming out just a month before the PS3 in North America. The closure of Clover Studio, announced a few weeks after Okami's North American release, also impacted its commercial performance. The studio's dissolution, driven by poor sales of this game as well as the earlier title on this list, God Hand, meant there was less long-term support and promotion for the game. The game's director Hideki Kamiya reflected on this in a 2024 interview, stating, "The initial shipment was 90,000 units. It was a huge failure. If it had been successful, Clover would have probably continued." He further noted, however, "For those of us who made it, it turned out something we can be proud of," highlighting the eternal disconnect between artistic achievement and commercial reality. Uru: Ages Beyond Mist, released in 2003 by Cyan Worlds and published by Ubisoft, is the fourth game in the groundbreaking Myst series. It shifted to a modern-day setting, allowing players to customize avatars and explore an abandoned city, solving puzzles and uncovering story clues. It was well received for its gorgeous graphics, immersive atmosphere, and intriguing lore, continuing the series' tradition of deep storytelling. The game's puzzles, while sometimes seen as easy for hardcore fans, were well integrated, and the shift to a third-person perspective offered a fresh take. The award-winning soundtrack, composed by Tim Larkin, was great and even featured a song performed by Peter Gabriel, the original frontman for the rock band Genesis, who himself said the game succeeded well in creating a feeling of other worlds in which mystery and imagination were the compelling elements. Despite taking over 5 years and $12 million to complete, Uru had serious cuts to its content that hurt sales. Most notably, the much anticipated Uru Live, a massively multiplayer online component which didn't end up launching until years later. Even so, critical response was generally positive, making the failure of the game disappointing. Rand Miller, co-founder of Cyan Worlds, has said, "We were really excited about the online component, but unfortunately the timing wasn't right. Broadband wasn't as widespread as we hoped, and the market for online games was still developing." In the meantime, the team got to work on the 5th installment of the series. Just before it was finished though, they had to lay off most of their staff and cease all development as they ran out of money. But there's a happy ending this time, because a few weeks later Miller was able to pull a rabbit out of his hat and secure funding to continue, allowing the studio to rehire most of their staff. Amazingly, the company is still active and still headed up by Rand Miller to this day. Rare's 2001 platform game Conker's Bad Fur Day follows Conker, a red squirrel, as he navigates a bizarre world to return home after a night of binge drinking, all while dealing with a hangover. The surprising mix of bright, cartoony graphics and very mature adult themes and humor surprised a lot of people. In fact, just take one look at the commercial that aired for the game and even you might be pretty surprised that everyone involved from Rare to Nintendo actually agreed to it. Critical acclaim followed the launch, with most reviewers commenting on the excellent graphics that one might have expected from one of the top Nintendo-affiliated studios of the era. They also highlighted its cleverly lewd script and dead-on movie spoofs, with IGN calling it quite possibly the most hilarious title ever created, and praising its remarkably deep, well-paced level design, tightly knitted control mechanics, and amazing sound quality. The game features an overworld where players can transition between levels, and it even includes a multiplayer mode for up to 4 players in a surprisingly diverse 7 different game types. But as with what we've seen elsewhere on this list, getting an M rating on a Nintendo console in the 2000s can almost always be counted on to spell doom for your title, or at the very least make it very hard to achieve huge mainstream success, and Conker's Bad Fur Day was no exception. Selling only 55,000 copies in its first month, the game was a total flop, the M rating issue exacerbated by a high cost due to using the expanded 64MB cartridge. Coming out for the Game Boy Advance in 2004, the remake of the original 1986 Metroid game, Metroid Zero Mission, updates the graphics and gameplay for the new millennium, even adding new areas, items, mini-bosses, and a rewritten story exploring Samus's past via a narrative-driven experience and including some decent cinematics. But despite the expanded content, the game carried with it some of the dated qualities of the original, most notably the short length, which might have been fine in the 80s, but in the mid-2000s people were expecting a little more meat. In a review in Eurogamer, Rob Fahey said, "Every minute of that 5 hours was excellent, and Zero Mission takes its place as one of the finest titles in the GBA's already impressive pantheon of platformers. However, we can't help but wish that it had been longer." Considering criticism of the short length, people were still buying the game at a decent pace at first, and the initial month the game did sell pretty well. Reversing the trend of many of the other games on this list though, sales of this one tanked in the following months. To blame is likely the announcement of the Nintendo DS right around a month after release. With the next generation on the way, a lot of potential buyers decided instead to save up for future titles, the curse of many games that release near the end of a cycle. Bethesda had a bit of a bumpy road to get where they are today, unafraid to take a few risks here and there on titles that ended up being bad investments. One of these was called Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. But one can hardly blame them for thinking this survival horror game would do well. The game has some pretty unique systems, like atmospheric immersion that features no HUD, players forced to rely on their senses like sound cues and visual effects for feedback, or an in-depth and realistic health system requiring specific remedies for injuries like splints for broken legs. Like the other Lovecraftian horror game on this list, Call of Cthulhu also features a sanity mechanic, where looking at disturbing elements causes hallucinations and sound distortion, potentially leading to insanity, with sanctuaries or defeating enemies restoring your faculties. Kristen Reed, writing for Eurogamer, explaining the poor launch results of Call of Cthulhu, wrote that it was issued right in the thick of a busy release period to zero fanfare, pointing the finger at poor timing and a lack of marketing support. The very long development cycle of the game, taking 6 years to make, further contributed to the failure, though it did enable the appropriately named developer, Headfirst Productions, to begin working on sequels at the same time. Unfortunately, Bethesda disagreed, and unable to find another publisher, the sequels were cancelled and Headfirst folded. Arx Fatalis is a first-person action RPG from 2002 set in a world where the sun has failed, forcing all creatures to live underground. It offers a dark, immersive atmosphere praised by critics. Its spellcasting system, using mouse gestures to draw runes, was innovative and fun, while open-ended gameplay gives a lot of player freedom to choose skills in magic, combat, or stealth with multiple ways to complete quests. The rune drawing spell system was one of the most praised features. This was described by one reviewer as probably the most fun I've had with magic in a game in a long time, offering a level of interactivity that was fresh in 2002. On the Xbox, it was adapted to use D-pad combinations, maintaining its uniqueness. Marketing was a significant barrier though, with the game initially marketed by Fish Tank and later Joe Wood Productions, neither of which were major publishers. Joe Wood in particular lacked the funds for effective promotion, especially in the US market. Christoph Carrier of developer Arcane Studios stated in a 2007 Rock Paper Shotgun interview, Joe Wood didn't have the money to hype the game in the US, so it didn't succeed in terms of mass sales. This limited penetration meant the game struggled to reach a wide audience, contributing to its commercial failure. Arcane Studios, who would eventually become famous mainly for its Dishonored series, was encouraged though by the game's critical success and fished around for a new publisher. As it turned out, Ubisoft was interested, but not in an Arx Fatalis 2. They wanted Arcane to use their engine for a Might and Magic game instead, resulting in Dark Messiah of Might and Magic a couple years later. Taking place in the rich gothic tabletop World of Darkness universe of Vampire the Masquerade, Bloodlines is an action RPG that follows a newly turned vampire navigating the dark underbelly of early 21st century Los Angeles, unraveling a conspiracy surrounding a mysterious relic that could spell doom for all vampires. The game stands out for its deep integration of mechanics from the tabletop game, particularly its clan system. Players can choose from 7 vampire clans: Bruja, Gangrel, Malkavian, Nosferatu, Toreador, Tremere, or Ventru, each with unique abilities, weaknesses, and dialogue options that significantly alter gameplay and narrative perception. It also excels in offering meaningful player agency, allowing progress through violent or non-violent means such as combat, stealth, or dialogue driven by persuasion or seduction stats. Built on Valve's Source engine, Bloodlines blends first-person and third-person perspectives, which enables seamless transitions between exploration, combat, and dialogue. While the combat was criticized by some reviewers for being a little bit clunky, the engine enabled detailed environments and expressive NPC animations which were impressive for 2004. Marketing efforts for the game, which released in a very competitive field alongside Half-Life 2, Metal Gear Solid, and Halo 2, were limited due to a contract with Valve for the use of the Source engine. For example, Activision couldn't release Bloodlines before Half-Life 2, and it couldn't even be announced to the public before Valve's highly anticipated sequel. Attempts were made to market the game at venues like E3, but it wasn't enough to really get the word out on time. Bloodlines drastically undersold developer Troika's first 2 games, Arcanum and the Temple of Elemental Evil, leading to rumors that the studio had shut down. This made it especially difficult for them to secure a new publisher for their next game, resulting in the studio actually shutting down shortly thereafter. Deadhead Fred released in 2007 to somewhat mixed reviews, but critics were near unanimous in their praise for it in one regard: the story. In fact, the story was so good it won the first ever Writers Guild of America award for video game writing that year, beating out other nominees like The Witcher, Crash of the Titans, World in Conflict, and The Simpsons game. Deadhead Fred is an action-adventure game for the PlayStation Portable that combines 1940s-style film noir with contemporary horror, creating so-called twisted noir atmospheres. Players control Fred Newman, a private investigator murdered and decapitated by a mob boss who must solve his own murder using the heads of defeated enemies. The game's standout feature is its head-switching mechanic, central to both combat and exploration. Fred starts with his brain and eyes in a jar, but can collect 9 different heads. Each head offers specific abilities, 7 of which are combat-oriented. Interestingly, the game starred John C. McGinley, a fairly well-known actor famous for his role in Scrubs in various movies like Office Space and Platoon. While the trailer was shown at E3 the year before release, no other real attempts were made by the publisher to market the game. Lead designer Adam Cohan did start up a dev blog to help generate excitement, but this ambitious handheld entry failed to catch on, as some think it should have. Conan the Barbarian made his first appearance in 1932 via a series of fantasy stories published in Weird Tales magazine by author Robert E. Howard. Since then, 10 Conan video games have been attempted, 11 if you include Broforce's Bronan the Barbarian in 2013. One such attempt, developed by Nihilistic Software and published by THQ in 2007, was an action-adventure game with the iconic protagonist voiced by none other than movie actor Ron Perlman, who's surprisingly prolific in the gaming world, with credits in Halo 2, 3, Payday 2, Call of Duty Black Ops 3, and most famously the Fallout series. This game puts players in control of Conan as he navigates several environments inspired by 1934's short story Queen of the Black Coast, in which Conan has a brief romance with Belit, a pirate queen, and has to seek revenge for her death against a demonic creature. The story and voice acting were well received, and the music, composed by Mike Reagan, was particularly acclaimed with its militaristic orchestra tunes, enhancing the epic feel. Notably, the music was performed live at video game live shows, such as the October 2000 event in Los Angeles. Many complained, though, that Conan copied too much from the successful God of War, which it was of course compared unfavorably to, an unfortunate reality for most games in this genre around that time. Conan did get attention from one unlikely place, becoming one of the primary targets of a proposed law in the mid-2000s in California to regulate the distribution of M-rated games in the state. The law was blocked by a legal challenge from the industry in 2007, but ironically, Governor Schwarzenegger, himself the star of the 1982 film Conan, appealed the decision. His appeal was later rejected as unconstitutional by federal court. Developed by BioWare and published by Microsoft, Jade Empire had a fairly large budget and solid industry backing. Released as an Xbox exclusive in 2005, the game features a world inspired by Chinese mythology, where players take on the role of the last surviving spirit monk, as he or she, depending on the player's choice, seeks to defeat the dark forces threatening the Jade Empire. Players make morality-based dialogue choices that impact the narrative and gameplay, following paths like open palm or closed fist, meaning good or evil. And gameplay combines real-time action with RPG elements, particularly in its combat system. Players can learn various martial arts styles, such as the aggressive tiger style or the evasive crane style, and upgrade abilities through a skill tree. Jade Empire was a hit with critics, but it way underperformed in sales, failing to even crack the million-copy barrier. For BioWare's first ever original RPG IP, this was a sore blow. Co-founder Greg Zeshuk blamed Microsoft, who urged a release on the Xbox instead of waiting for the next gen. Zeshuk commented in a 2025 interview, "Microsoft said, no, you must release now at the end of the cycle, it's the perfect time." And it was the worst idea. Completely stupid advice from them. One of the dumbest things of all time. If we had held the game and released it on the 360, we could have polished more, improved the combat, and it would have become a great success at the beginning of the new generation. Give us 6 months and we could have created another weighty franchise. Perhaps he's right, but we will never know for sure. But if releasing near the very end of a console's life cycle is tough, releasing a year after that is darn near self-sabotage. Developed by then relatively unknown developer WayForward, Shantae, about a half-genie who must stop the evil lady pirate Risky Boots from stealing the magical sequin stones, came out for the Game Boy Color in 2002, the third last game to release for that system. In case you're wondering, the other two were Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets and Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warriors, both of which sold reasonably well off the strengths of their respective multimedia franchise IPs. But for the late-to-the-party Shantae, there was only the game's excellent 2D platforming, vibrant art style, catchy music, and neat features like transformation dances, a day and night cycle, and interesting puzzle solving to build a new audience off of. Matt Bozon, the game's designer and creative director of WayForward, admitted later, "We were very naive, believing that if the game was good, it would sell anyway." Though he noted, Shantae had to exist, even if just to reach out and see if there was an audience reaching back. Unlike BioWare's Greg Zeshuk with Jade Empire, Bozon has never publicly blamed the publisher Capcom, despite them reportedly holding onto the game for the better part of a year prior to launch. A class act. And of course, Shantae, who was actually created by Bozon's wife, did eventually find her audience. Too sexy to be a kid's brand, and too girly to be a male gamer brand, she'd nevertheless returned 5 more times and counting, becoming a favorite for many gamers. The 7th entry in the Oddworld series, known for its quirky and very detailed worlds, Stranger's Wrath introduces players to Stranger, a mysterious bounty hunter that has to pursue and capture outlaws to collect bounties, ultimately aiming to earn enough moolah for a mysterious life-saving operation. What sets the game apart is its innovative gameplay mechanics. It combines first-person shooting with third-person platforming and melee combat in a fluid and dynamic way, offering plenty of balanced variety. The core combat dynamic revolves around the live ammunition system, where Stranger uses small creatures as projectiles for his crossbow. Live ammunition, get it? Capturing outlaws alive yields more money than killing them, encouraging non-lethal play, which adds a layer of depth and challenge to the game. Stranger's Wrath was critically acclaimed, earning an 88 on Metacritic, with reviews highlighting its originality and design. Following the failure of the game, Lorne Lanning, the creator and head of the developer Oddworld Inhabitants Inc., became so disenchanted that he quit the gaming industry. On his way out the door, he dished on why he thought the game failed, saying, Stranger's Wrath wasn't advertised or marketed because Electronic Arts couldn't get its PlayStation 2 port of our Xbox original to run, and if EA isn't on all SKUs, it just won't promote the game. It was very disheartening to us that we could have a title with a user metric of 9.6 out of 10, a game that was praised as being a fusion of filmmaking and video games in terms of being less gamey and more story and character driven, and then to see that the largest publisher in the industry had no interest in marketing it regardless of how innovative it was. An incredible accusation that painted EA in a very negative light. If true, it meant that the publisher effectively sabotaged a perfectly good game for soulless corporate reasons. Then again, this is EA we're talking about. For his part, Landing returned to the industry to help work on a couple more Oddworld games years later, most recently with 2021's Oddworld Soulstorm, where again he found himself at odds with the state of game publishing, opining that the game having been downloaded for free over 4 million times on PlayStation Plus proved a devastating blow for the game and its developer. I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same. Coming out for the Wii in 2007, Zack and Wiki Quest for Barbarossa's Treasure innovatively combines traditional adventure game mechanics with Wii motion controls, offering a staggering 80+ gestures like pulling levers, playing a flute, or shaking the remote to transform enemies into tools. Additionally, the game features a guide cursor system, having other players jump in and assist with cursors, leading to a cooperative party-style atmosphere that creates a fun social aspect for the game for friends and families. Zack and Wiki was praised for its controls, unique gameplay, and originality, and even earned several awards and accolades. But the game didn't catch on with Wii gamers, which was proving a tough nut to crack for third-party developers in the mid-2000s. Capcom product manager Colin Ferris said not too long after launch, "Well, you know, Zack and Wiki, another one in a long lifeline of very highly rated Capcom games that unfortunately did not sell very well. We can take a part of the blame on ourselves by having it star a shirtless boy pirate. That is actually a personal favorite of a lot of people in Capcom, so don't be surprised if you see it again, but we have nothing in the works at the moment." As of 2025, Capcom still has nothing in the works as far as a sequel at least, though for what it's worth, the game did receive a re-release on the Wii U's eShop in 2016. The world is an interesting place with lots of different cultures, each with their own unique histories and peoples. This means sometimes there's going to be things that end up being popular in one place even when everywhere else in the world just doesn't get it. Here are some games that did well enough in one region but flopped elsewhere. Little King's Story is a charming and innovative RTS/life sim/RPG with action-adventure elements that released for the Nintendo Wii in 2009. In the genre-bending title, players assume the role of King Kurobo, a young shy boy who discovers a magical crown in a forest near his village. This crown grants him the ability to charm people and make them follow his orders, transforming him into the ruler of a small kingdom. The game's narrative centers on Kurobo's quest to expand his kingdom and take over the world, guided by his trusty advisors. Commanding your followers in a way that plays similar to Pikmin, the game's visual charm, quirky humor, and memorable cast, including, in contrast to Pikmin, your loyal subjects, have been praised by critics and players alike. Created by Japanese developer Sing, the game was relegated to a moderate level of success in a single region, though surprisingly, this region was not actually Japan but the PAL territories. Releasing first in Australia and Europe, months ahead of North America and Japan, Sing and their publishers were hoping to highlight the game's European cultural influence. Creator Yoshiro Kimura reflected in an interview, "When I started traveling inside of Europe, what I finally realized is that what I read in European books, The Little Prince or whatever, I finally started to understand where those books come from and what they're talking about. It was the first time for me that I started to feel the culture." This cultural aspect naturally resonated with European audiences, who appreciated its fairy tale aesthetic and narrative, drawing from European literary traditions like The Little Prince, which Kimura referenced. The aesthetic seems to have turned off American gamers though, who in 2009 were generally more interested in hardcore action games with more mature and gritty titles. As for Japan, the simplicity of the game, relative glut of similar titles, and deliberate catering to overseas audiences doomed the game in its home country. A non-linear open-world RPG developed by German and Polish studio Reality Pump, Two Worlds was panned by critics in America on release for its buggy and unpolished state at launch. The interface and graphics were considered poor, and the dialogue written by Reality Pump themselves instead of hiring professional writers was also criticized. Interestingly though, the game was very well received in its home country of Germany, where over 50 gaming publications had featured glowing reviews. Many especially praised the soundtrack, which was composed by Harold Faltermeyer, the German musician behind the 80s hit Axel F. This convinced gamers in Europe to give it a shot, and it ended up doing well enough there to result in a sequel in 2011, which did extremely well, selling millions of copies. I guess in the end, Two Worlds was a more appropriate name for this game than the developers even realized. Ico is an action-adventure game developed and published by Sony for the PlayStation 2. The game follows Ico, a young boy with horns imprisoned in a mysterious castle who must escape with Yorda, a princess threatened by the castle's queen. Ico's main claim to fame is its minimalist design, focusing on immersion with minimal dialogue and a subtracting design approach, as described by director Fumito Ueda. This approach involves removing any elements that interfere with the game's reality, one example being replacing warriors with the shadow creatures you see in the final version. The approach helped in both achieving a unique dreamlike aesthetic as well as bringing system requirements in line with those the PS2 were capable of. The gameplay emphasizes exploration and puzzles, with the emotional bond between Ico and Yorda conveyed through subtle interactions like holding hands, resonating deeply with players. And the art style, inspired by Italian painter Giorgio de Chirico, uses bloom lighting and keyframe animation to craft a hauntingly beautiful world. The game underperformed expectations pretty much everywhere, but it totally flopped in North America. Yasuhide Kobayashi, VP at Sony, blamed the box art and marketing, saying in 2009, "If the packaging was designed differently, we think it could have sold more. In fact, on the internet, many people have said the Japanese version was better." As mentioned by some of you in comments in the previous videos, box art really did matter in previous eras of gaming. Back in 2001, this was still a major factor in successfully marketing a game. And for Ico, there's a stark contrast between the American and Japanese versions, with many arguing that the Japanese version is superior for its uniqueness, with the American one looking bland and generic. Compounding problems, an American release in September 2001 made it really difficult to market just about anything, much less a niche Japanese video game. When Katamari Damacy came out in 2004, it came as a huge surprise to everyone involved that the game was so successful. Even, or perhaps especially, creator Keita Takahashi. Jokingly referred to by some as a snowball simulator, the game basically involves rolling a magical adhesive ball around to collect objects, starting from small items like thumbtacks and growing to include humans, buildings, and even mountains. The settings and characters are highly stylized and surreal, often celebrating and satirizing Japanese culture, with humorous cutscenes featuring the royal family and the Hoshino family. The music, composed by Yu Miyake, blends electronic, jazz, and samba styles, even featuring vocals from J-pop singers and anime voice actors. It was so good it ended up winning awards such as Soundtrack of the Year from both IGN and GameSpot. But even after the game proved a hit in Japan, Namco was worried that it wouldn't translate well in North America. Takahashi even turned down requests to attend E3, insisting they weren't initially planning to have a Western release. Their humility made retailers nervous. The game was a pretty weird and untested premise after all, and they figured most people probably wouldn't understand the Japanese cultural references either. So only a few copies per retail location were ordered, with just 120,000 copies ever being shipped overseas in total. As it turned out, everyone was wrong again. Americans love the game as much as Japanese gamers, and it garnered critical acclaim and rapidly sold out everywhere. While the reasons for all the hesitancy make perfect sense even in retrospect, imagine how the game might have done abroad had Namco gone all in on marketing and distributing this classic. Despite the reluctant start, Katamari became a successful series that's still going to this day on just about every platform out there. Published by Square Enix in 2006, Valkyrie Profile 2 followed up on the moderate success of the cult classic first entry in the series. The story centers on the princess Alicia, who shares her body with the soul of Silmeria, a rebellious Valkyrie forcibly reincarnated by Odin after defying him. This dual soul dynamic drives the narrative as Alicia and Silmeria work together to thwart Odin's plans and prevent a catastrophic war between mortals and gods. Unlike the original's 2D turn-based battles, Silmeria features a real-time turn-based hybrid in a 3D battlefield. Players control a party of up to 4 characters, positioning them strategically to exploit enemy weaknesses. The system rewards precise timing and combos, with Soul Crush finishing moves adding flair. As in the original game, dungeons in Valkyrie Profile 2 play more like a 2D platformer, which is a unique and surprising twist that added some variety to gameplay. Another relative rarity is the ability to recruit up to 20 of the 40 available playable characters per run, which enhances replayability. The game sold well in Japan, even if not exactly as well as other Square Enix hits. However, global sales were not up to expectations, with the game earning IGN's award for Best Game No One Played in 2006. Could be the game's anime-inspired physical humor didn't resonate well with Western audiences, and the game was considered too difficult by some American critics. But most critically, marketing for the game by Square Enix was insufficient, with most of their attention focused on the launch of Final Fantasy XII, which came out only a month later in North America and totally overshadowed Valkyrie Profile 2. If you watched our Flops of the 90s video, then you already know the story of Mother 2, also known as Earthbound, and its disastrous attempt at releasing overseas, only to flop, costing Nintendo and developer HAL Laboratory a lot of money in the process. It probably comes as no surprise then that when it came to the third game in the trilogy, Mother 3, they decided to completely pass on localizing anywhere outside Japan. Following a somewhat protracted and turbulent development process that began under the assumption that this would be a SNES game, only to transfer to an N64 when the team became inspired by what was happening with Mario 64, switching again to the 64DD add-on for the N64 when the game grew too big and it was obvious that they need the extra memory, and then finally landing on releasing for the Game Boy Advance after the add-on for the N64 itself proved a failure. That final switch to the GBA essentially required a whole redo, and while the story itself didn't change, there were some major changes made to the game, such as switching from 3D graphics that were planned for the N64 back to the 2D of the first two games. It's no wonder that it took 10 years to make the game. Unfortunately, the delay made it a certainty that localization would never happen, considering it came out so late in the Game Boy Advance's life cycle 2 years after the DS had already gone live. The game was fairly successful in Japan, though it didn't do as well as many had hoped. And here's where we address the elephant in the room. How did this game make it on a list of flops when it only released in Japan and didn't exactly flop there either? If you need an explanation and it's not good enough to just say we wanted an excuse to talk about an excellent and classic RPG, let's just say it's possible the game flopped in an opportunity cost sort of way. You see, fans in the English-speaking world were so fanatical about the game and so eager to try it that they took it upon themselves to create a translated version. A team of a dozen people donated an estimated $30,000 worth of their own time localizing it with great care, and when they were finally finished, it received an enormous 100,000 downloads in a single week from Starmen.net, without the benefit of a publisher or major marketing campaign or anything. If that doesn't scream missed opportunity, I don't know what does. In a move that's shockingly uncharacteristic for Nintendo, according to a member of the translation team, the higher-ups at the corporation knew all about the translation project and decided not to intervene. A wholesome, happy ending to finish on. If you've made it this far, we'd really appreciate if you would consider subscribing to our channel and liking the video. Your support means a lot.